So today we're going to talk about the truth about the national debt. Now, as you know, I don't include politics in any of my videos. I'm gonna stick to the facts and then I'll show you how to translate the numbers that are presented. So the first thing to understand about any fundamental principles of budgeting is that when you spend more than you bring in, you go into debt. If you're bringing in more than you're spending, you have a surplus and you can put that away in savings or choose what you want to do with that money, right? So for a household taking on debt, usually that's in the form of like credit cards or loans, both of which you're going to have to pay interest on that debt while you're paying it off. So each fiscal year, the government either spends more than it makes, in which case you have a deficit, or it brings in more than it spends, in which case the government ends up with surplus. Well, we've had very few surplus years in the history of our country, and I'm going to show you this chart right here. As you can see, the national debt increased by fiscal year, and these are in millions of dollars, right? So all the way down in 1977, 78, it was really tiny. We're talking, I think it was like $78 million deficit. And the highest here is over $4.5 trillion deficit in 1 year, and that was during Trump administration. What you can see, you can tell by this graph, is overall the trend goes higher over time, right? So the more current years, we've been blowing up our deficit spending every year. The blue represents Democratic presidents and the red represents Republican presidents. And what I found was a little surprising myself was that in Republican years, the deficit spending tends to go up every year. And in Democrat years or administrations, the deficit spending tends to trend downwards, which I was actually kind of surprised about. But I guess it makes sense when you start considering that Democrats tend to want to raise taxes to cover all the spending, and Republicans try to cut taxes in order to stimulate growth in the economy. I'm not here to argue which one is better or worse, but I can tell you from a pure financial standpoint is that whenever you're cutting your revenue and your spending is the same or even increases, you're going to end up with a greater deficit, won't you? So that kind of stimulus can be good for the economy in terms of job creation and wealth generation. The downside of that, however, is that those tax cuts are usually not made up for completely by the growth in the economy. So you have additional deficit spending. Also, the 1 year there from 1999 2000 during the Clinton administration, where we actually had a surplus. Well, a bunch of things were happening at the same time, right? And some of those are kind of out of the control of administrations. Yes, Clinton raised taxes, but also they were able to push through a package to actually cut federal spending. So those two things combined contributed to that surplus for that year. But ever since then, our trend of deficit spending has been going up each year. So with this data, I was able to consolidate the information to make it a little more digestible for you. Each president here, if they're in blue, they're Democrat, and if they're light red, they're Republican, right? So what I did is I totaled up how much debt increase to our deficit both Democrats and Republicans did, total, and then I divided by the years they were in service to give you an average year total that they contributed to our national debt. Jimmy Carter was the lowest. As you can see, over time, the average per year spending steadily increased. You had a couple big jumps, though, one from Jimmy Carter to Ronald Reagan, and then again from Bill Clinton to George Bush, and then again from Obama to Donald Trump. So what's the takeaway here? Well, both parties have substantially contributed to our debt by having deficit years in almost every year of their administration. So the main difference between the national deficit and the national debt. Think of it this way. All the deficits from all the years that I just showed you on that screen, you're going to add them all up together, and that total sum is what we owe as a country, and that is what's called the national debt. So just like with any household budget, you can increase your income, you can reduce your expenses, or do a combination of both. As a financial coach helping individuals and families, I mostly focus on reducing expenses because that is the one area that is more in control of that individual in order to effectively change quickly. It's the complete opposite for the government usually, because there's a number of things that they can do to raise money in the form of greater taxes, tariffs, fees, all that good stuff. On the other hand, it's much harder for them to cut expenses. Let's get into why. So the Congressional Budget Office released this infographic for fiscal year 22, which starts October 1st, 2022, which goes all the way to September 30th of 2023. It's a pretty handy little site here, and I'll have the link in the comments if you'd like to take a look at it yourself. But as you can see here, the spending is $6.3 trillion for 2022, and the total revenues are only going to be about $4.9 trillion. So, which gives you a deficit of about $1.4 trillion. That's just tacked on top of our budget, our national debt, right? And it's broken down into three categories. You have mandatory spending, which I'll get into, discretionary, and then the net interest that we're paying on the outstanding debt that we have currently. So you scroll down, it goes a little more into detail, and as you scroll over, it'll actually highlight each item and give you more explanation on those items. So for the mandatory, you're looking at Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. That's the bulk of the mandatory category, of which the government is already obligated to make those payments each year. So it's really tough to try to cut any of those. And what you're left with is your discretionary spending and the net interest on our current debt, right? So the only thing you can really change is the discretionary spending. You have defense and non-defense. Defense is like the third rail of politics to try to cut. Both Democrats and Republicans do not like to cut the defense budget. So especially in the last 30, 40 years, they've been very aggressive about increasing the defense budget. So the only part you have left is the non-defense budget of $910 billion, while our deficit is $1.4 trillion. So even if you cut every non-defense discretionary service, I mean, you're talking about education, infrastructure, all that stuff, right? You're still going to be in a deficit. So in order to reach a balanced budget, or even, dare I say, a surplus, we may need to have some conversations about, what a fair tax system would include, right? Because you need to increase your revenue or cut spending, or a combination of both, right? So when it comes to spending, we're going to have to look at the defense spending, maybe have to look at the entitlement program. All of this stuff needs to be part of the discussion in order to regain some sense of responsibility, because this is just unsustainable what we're doing right now. But the reality is, every politician is going to continue to get lobbied and be pressured against raising taxes, and they're also going to be pressured to not reduce spending. These special interests that gain from all that spending, they're not going to want that to go away. So because of this, it's likely that we're going to continue to see deficit spending year over year, increasing our national debt. So the only way that I see this changing is if we, the people, actually stand up and start taking action in the form of, organizing, voting, very important, and because the end result is this is on our shoulders, right? Not only ours, but our children and our future grandchildren and so on. And by kicking this can continually down the road, it's only going to make those consequences more severe over time. You're looking at reduced benefits, higher interest rates, higher taxes, that something has to give at some point. So on that happy note, I'm going to end the video here. Next week, we're going to cover the debt ceiling and how it may affect you. All right, that's it. Take care. Bye.